Okay now, good. Well, good morning. I call this meeting to order, and we would like to recognize that the meeting is being held on the traditional territory of the Lillooet Nation. Have a motion to approve the agenda, please. Moved and seconded. For question in favour, opposed, motion carries. Have a consent agenda. Motion to approve that, please. Moved and seconded. Okay, call a question on that. All in favour? Opposed? Motion carries. Good, thank you. Any business arising from the minutes? I didn't see any myself. Did anybody else? Nope. Okay, new business. CAO verbal update. Over to you, Mr. Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. Just to remind the committee, because it's been a while, that the committee recommended the board and the board approved moving forward with the hiring of a consultant or facilitator to support the board's decision to undertake a governance review or to address the governance and excellence in governance initiative that the board had established. We went out with an RFP, and we're not pleased with what came back, so we've moved to a sole source approach as directed by the board, and we're happy this morning to have Ms. Lawrenson join the committee to speak to her proposal or approach to supporting this board initiative.
Okay, thank you. With that, any questions for Craig? Do I need to move receipt of that? Yeah. Motion to move receipt of Craig's report moved and seconded. Question in favour, opposed, motion carries. So we then go on to proposed work plan for the SLRD Governance Excellence Initiative Project, and turn this meeting over to Tracy Lawrenson. Welcome, and thanks for being here. So
it's my absolute pleasure to be here. Do you want me to just briefly give you an overview of my background for the committee? Would that be helpful?
Yes, I think it would.
So I'm a lawyer by training, practiced law with what was then Lidstone Young Anderson, focused on supporting local governments, and then left there and went to ECOM as the corporate secretary to their board of directors. So got a designation in governance through McMaster University, and really have been focusing that governance lens on local governments and balancing the systems, structures, and behaviors that contribute to good governance. Because governance is both a framework for decision making and the individuals that show up inside that framework. So in discussion with Craig, my understanding is that this board has really prioritized the way you make decisions as being something you want to focus on and improve. And you've got a reputation of being a high functioning board. So the feedback I have from Craig is this is not a broken group. You know, we're not fixing something that's broken, but it is a group with a desire to be excellent, to not just soldier through and survive this sort of 4-year term, but to leave the regional district better placed through good governance than when you arrived. And like a lot of groups, and again, I haven't done a deep dive into the SLRD yet, but like a lot of groups, you probably have some hardening of the arteries around some of the ways you do things. So there are often opportunities to streamline. You know, a lot of our governance evolves based on individuals that were at the table at different times. And quite often we add things, but we don't get as disciplined about taking things away. And so sometimes, and I know this, you know, lawyers, we lead you down this path too, because we create, you know, the fear of risk if you don't do this. So we just keep doing more things, and we create a very real risk that decision-making is frustrating. So my discussion with Craig was around, first of all, finding out how the board feels about its governance, and also asking the senior management, you know, the starting point is, where are we now? And some of that involves, you know, how long are your meetings? And the length of a meeting is just a data point. Just for example, a long meeting where there's robust discussions on the most important matters is a great meeting. But unpacking a little bit about diagnosing where the regional district is. And my preferred approach is not to go in and wipe everything out that anybody's doing and start fresh. First of all, who's got time for that? I don't imagine that the board, is hiring multiple people to run this. This is likely to be a project that's being done in addition to the responsibilities. So as a consultant, the first step is to make sure that I'm not creating a new problem while I'm helping you solve, create an opportunity out of your governance process. We have a tool that we use for our governance check-ins. We call it GovRx because, of course, when boards look at their governance, the first thing is to identify what's this board dealing with. And the stuff that's working well, for goodness sakes, we don't want to muck that up. But also, where are the pain points? Where are the frustrations? Regional district models are tricky governance, even when they're perfect. Balancing the interest of electoral area directors. Then you've got municipalities that have a lot more bench strength before they come together. So understanding those nuances of how effectively are your committees supporting the board's decision-making, for example? Is there the appropriate delegation of authority to staff, to committees, and otherwise? But the starting point, from my perspective, is to find out where you are now. This is a governance check-in that is healthy anyways, but then to look at where are the opportunities for the highest and best use of improvements. So you have the framework, is that correct? Just in terms of going through it, what I would like to do is, as quickly as you think is appropriate with the board, is get that survey out, get that information back. And Craig, I would really appreciate also getting the input of the leadership folks that are board facing. We don't commingle that data, but it is interesting to see what's the back end of the operation. Like, how much work is it creating to service this committee? That, so having some of that sort of data, the next step of that would be to come back to the board with, here's the 3 areas of greatest opportunity. If you were to make, and to do this in a bit of an incremental way, unless, of course, you as a board say that you want to, throw a lot of new resources at this. For the most part, and Craig, I'll defer to you on this, but the ability to implement changes around governance are going to be predicated on the bench that you have now. And especially with some of the changes you've got at your leadership level, that's both an opportunity in terms of changes, sometimes easier when change is happening, but also just recognizing that there's going to be a bit of a resource drain. So developing a work plan after the survey around what are the, highest value changes. The other opportunity in local governments is to, the universe sends us clues. You're not a startup tech company that nobody's ever done what you do. So finding those, the opportunity of having worked with different regional districts, there are different things that different regional districts do really well that I can also, through this process, point you to, because we want to make sure that you're recognized for the things you do really well, but that you can also pick and choose those things that have already been tried elsewhere. So really what you'll see in this is the starting point is identifying what's working well. It's kind of a good time as well, because even your new directors, how many new directors do you have, if I may?
3.
2. So generally you've got a chunk of the board that's been experienced through another term. That's kind of a nice mix. And then you've got some fresh eyes going, why do we do it this way? And we want to make sure this is kind of a great time, because we've still got those curious questions about, why is this coming to the board? The other thing that is a reality with the board is the need to discuss behaviorally, how do you interact, for example, with management? And what I mean by that is the assessment around meetings. If you want shorter agenda packages, hypothetically, that requires you as a board to assess the extent to which you trust your management. Like a lot of times these huge packages have evolved because the risk of not giving all the hyperlinks to all the background documents are greater than the benefit. So again, I don't know enough to know exactly where that original assessment will take us, but the point is to start with where you are now and then to identify the opportunities for the greatest areas of improvement. Any questions on that sort of general philosophical approach? Does that resonate with you or sound completely off track? Because again, this is an adaptive process made for the SLRD. This is not a methodology that I'm just taking from 12 other places and plopping on top of you. The questions in that survey even will be specifically tailored to the SLRD, and I'll rely on Craig and some subset of this group to find out what are the things that you already know are pain points that we can get better data on. I think.
Sorry, Tony, did you call on me?
I'm sorry?
Did you call on me? Yeah, okay. Thank you through the chair. Thanks, Tracy, for being here and for describing that approach. I think my one hesitation is our committee or our board and this committee, I think, are quite good at identifying where the challenges are. Like
okay.
Our meeting was like, I think, and Craig, maybe you can pull this up. We have a list of things that we've delegated to this committee of like, here,
okay,
figure this out from how do we increase like delegation authority to try and streamline some of the work. And so I think one of the pieces is, to me, appreciate like we all need to get up to speed and we all need to understand where our strengths and weaknesses are and how different people see that.
Right.
But I think one of the challenges that we have is like, okay, then how do we prioritize and what does that work plan look like once we've done that work? And so I just want to make sure that that would be part of this work that you're doing, would be actually to help us identify where those top priorities are and the best way to action that work going forward.
And thank you for that question, Jenna, because I think you've raised an important point as well about even the order of operations. There's things that are foundational that we want to change, like delegation is a great one, Jenna. Sorry, I go to first names, I apologize. Is figuring out who does what, including delegation to committees. Because one of the things that I do see with regional districts is that committees are uncertain about where their authority sits, what has to come to the board, what comes to the board for information versus for decision. And sometimes we end up with boards redoing committee work. And, even discussions around what are the criteria that will apply to decision making. Electoral area directors, for example, know their areas very well, but there's sometimes governance anomalies or frustrations when, say, municipal directors weigh in on something, but what are the questions, the good governance questions that any director should be asking about any new initiative? It also relates to the delegation of authority to your CAO. And one of the really first steps is looking at your agendas. And because meetings are a source of positive energy and also the greatest frustration. So often starting with your meetings highlights looking at the agenda and saying, why did this come to the board at all? And generally from the CAO's chair, it's because the board has wanted that to come. And that sometimes requires candor back to the board about this is something that, you've had a super competent CAO, and I know you've got some changes there, but really making sure that you're not all up in the business of your managers. And there's some behavioral things that go beyond the structural bits that we need to weave in. But I think, if you said we want to start with delegation, I still think it's worth getting the feedback of the board as a whole around the structures of governance. But if delegation was the top one that came out, that's a really good one. Now the board has to, when the board talks about governance excellence, do they understand that that's not just the behind the scenes, Craig and his team squirreling away and filling in forms and that sort of thing? Governance excellence is a set of behaviors as well as the structure around it. And so this will if you want these governance changes, it also is going to create some discomfort around probably certain directors who are more comfortable with some of the patterns that may not be as productive to the board as a whole. So it is a change management exercise as well around the board. But I think that's important feedback, is if things have already been decided that they're important, we don't want to lose credibility with the remainder of the board by asking them what's important when they've already told you what's important.
I mean, I'd just like to clarify, I don't know if we've actually identified which one is the top priority. There is just a long laundry list of like things that need to get addressed that we've identified. So we're good at figuring out where the challenges are.
Excellent.
We aren't as good at figuring out, okay, which one do we prioritize and how do we move it forward, is my personal assessment of the situation.
And that's a question we can specifically ask. We can say, here are the top 5, 7, 10 opportunities for improvement. Drag and drop these in order of importance. You know, which ones do you think are the most important to do? Because I do know that with resources being limited in most local governments, that level of clarity will be really helpful for staff. And essentially it builds the work plan. And then, you know, with the caveat that even some things that are more important may be better done secondarily. You know, when you look at any project, even if something is top importance, there may be enabling pieces just a little lower down that make that change more effective. So I think that would be really helpful, is to go out with, here's what we know are opportunities for improvement. Where do you see the biggest impact on our region in terms of change? And Craig and the team are going to have insight into that as well, because they know how much time things are taking. You know, a 20-minute presentation to the board can sometimes take hours on the back end, depending on, you know, the number of committees it's already gone through and those processes. But really sort of thinking about when the board meets, every committee and every report, the only purpose for it is to aid the board's decision making. And so how streamlined are those processes? I haven't gotten under the hood, though, to really know where those opportunities. I think also on any of these projects, bluntly, we want to choose some things that are going to make a difference right away. You know, sometimes these projects become so big and heavy that nothing happens, and then we do a move that bus reveal in a year and people have lost interest in it. So what are the things that we can start to do and even try, you know, as we're moving this along? You know, and what are the biggest pain points? Let's choose a couple of those.
Rachel Bush-Jones. Can't hear you.
Great.
You're muted. There you go.
Well, at least I managed to put my hand down. Okay. Who's keeping the laundry list? Jenna has a much better memory than I do, but you know, I can only think of a couple. It would be very helpful to include that list in the Oh, Craig, direct. It's okay. Okay.
Well,
thank you. And
Kristen has kept the list, but we have a list.
I'm very glad to hear that. I do not have a list. Thank you. And I'm fine with first names.
How does everybody else feel about that in this particular circumstance? You okay if I just use first names?
I think so. We are
Okay.
live and we are in a formal meeting, but I think in this case it's appropriate, is my opinion.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, Tracy.
How long is that list?
Ray, can you answer that?
Yeah, through the chair, if memory serves, I think there are 6 or 8 items on that list. But there's certainly enough to include it as part of the any survey, if that's the approach that the board wanted to take, just to remind folks and help with the prioritization.
Tracy, I just have a question that when we started this process, we had absolutely no idea that we would be changing CAOs. So how difficult does that make it? You know, we're doing something now, knowing that at some point along the way, we're going to have a new CAO.
I think it's an excellent question around this. And some of it will depend on who your new CAO is, the extent to which they come with a knowledge of regional districts, or even whether they come from British Columbia and an understanding of it. I think there are, and Craig would be aware of this, is there are things that are style-wise related more to the CAO's role. And I would expect those are things we would want to leave, you know, leave till that individual. I don't think it means that you need to pause this or that it impacts this, other than being very cognizant that any change drags on resources in ways that are not visible, that any change or any new person. So in terms of the patience for the timing of this, I think, you know, through the chair to the committee and then to the board, is just that virtually everything on your strategic plan needs to just have a little bit of an asterisk beside it until you've got clarity around that. But there's a lot of work can be done that is not impacted by the personality or skill set that is in the CAO's chair. And I guess I would be interested in the CAO's perspective on that as well, because knowing his team, he may well be able to provide better context to me and to the committee on that.
Great.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. The first is that the way I understand Tracy does this work and engages the board, I think that, to her point, that work could be done that would not necessarily need to have the involvement of the CAO. It's largely some board work up front. And I think that aligns well with the strategic planning process as well, to the point around prioritization and getting things onto the action plan. Not too far down the road, September, October, the board will likely start looking at 2024 and prioritizing based on capacity and other pieces of work. So I think that would make sense. The other thing I would say is it would be a really good opportunity for an incoming CAO, once the board sets its priorities and establishes what it wants to look at, to really have a role to play with the staff in shaping that work and that engagement with the board. I think that would be really fundamental to relationship building and expectations, helping understand expectations on the part of the board and how they want to do business.
Thank you. Thanks. Back to you, Tracy.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, one of the things that I'm a big believer in is once we've got a sense of the top priorities, is the one great thing about our sector is that, different from, you know, if IBM calls up Apple and says, where'd you get those chips for your new computers? The reality is that we do have such an opportunity to collaborate with other regional districts and other also municipalities. You know, while regional districts are a different animal, there are elements of how information gets to a governing body that still there's a lot of learning. And what I would really suggest is that very little of this needs to be drawn out of thin air, and in particular, you know, with staffing resources, but looking for different communities. And, you know, it also depends on how high the SLRD wants to aim. You know, do you want to, you know, fix the cracks in the walls, or do you know, some of this is going to be how big do you want to aim, or do you want to be speaking at conferences about, you know, doing things differently in the regional district context. You know, some of this is around, are we aiming for gold, silver, or bronze? There's a cost in time and a need in resourcing and those sorts of things. Because bluntly, the regional district model it's a really challenging model, even when everything works well. And I think that that's something to remember, is that when things are frustrating, some of that's just our model we operate within. not the people that are around the table or the staff or any of that some of this is the model that you've been handed. Now, that being said, we're often not crystal clear on what an electoral area can do on their own, what needs to go to the board, what even the risks around that, because we've got clear language in our legislation, but there's also gray in terms of governance. Well, what if we did take a little bit of a risk and delegate this a little more aggressively? What would the benefit of that be? And I think there's some risk tolerance discussions that need to happen under governance, because things can be streamlined quite a bit, but it requires the board to have and demonstrate trust for where it's delegating those decisions to. And what would be the risk if a mistake was made? Because that's the fundamental question in delegation. What's the worst thing that would happen if a decision was made by this committee or by staff that wasn't what the board would have done if it had come forward? And, because I'm seeing regional district boards get involved in, choosing vendors. PS, if you're doing that, we need to stop. There's, just, and mainly because it creates significant legal risk to the board. It feels like it's a good thing, but it creates significant risk around, procurement decisions and those sorts of things. But there's often some, one of the things that I would suggest you need in a consultant doing something like this is the comfort speaking directly to the board about the ways in which the mechanics of your meetings need to be, and the way you show up, and the difference between a curious question and a material governance question. And I think those are sometimes a little more awkward.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. When this when I started thinking about governance and how our board operates, largely hamstrung by a procedure bylaw that hasn't been updated or reviewed for quite a long time. And the order of the agendas, and it was all I think I wasn't on the board for very long before the pandemic, maybe 2 years. But the pandemic caused us to look at the procedures bylaw in a way that, had to serve virtual meetings. And so, that was sort of the peeling back the first layer of what needs to change so that things are more efficient. And so it's really interesting to see where you want to go with this, to sort of look at that efficiency of that agenda. How can we streamline it? And then to all of the other points that you've made, how can we trust staff more to take on a lot of the sort of important but not urgent, or maybe it's urgent, but doesn't necessarily need board attention for every little thing, so that we can really maximize the best efficiency of, the talent within our organization. It creates a lot of trust. It raises morale within the organization. And then it also really streamlines and makes more efficient the board's use of their time, because it feels often that the 4 electoral area directors carry a burden that, that they have to do everything. And that I don't think is what we're elected to do. But I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong about that. And so I just wanted to share that with you.
Tracy.
I think your procedures bylaw is your bylaw to support your decision making, and your staff will follow whichever one's in place. But form should follow function. And if you've got this unique opportunity. So while the question was asked about your CAO change, you have a CAO who has nothing but upside in this process, because the level of candor that your CAO can demonstrate as somebody who, my understanding, is quite well respected by the board, but who, can say, you know, if I waved my magic wand, these are all the changes I'd make, having been here for a while and on my way out. You don't have somebody who's worried about the politics of how somebody will feel about things. Like, I think that the biggest thing for me is we got to get moving on this before Craig leaves, because we want to make sure that there is a significant input from his end on the areas of opportunity, especially knowing the talent of his team and the capacity and the areas. The other thing about this is this initiative that you're undertaking is something that should bode well in your recruitment of a CAO, particularly if it's framed in an exercise of trust building, role clarity. You know, there's the tone within which this has been shared with me by Craig is that this is very much an empowerment efficiency exercise about the board. And I think that is something, as somebody who works with 30 or 40 local governments, you know, mainly in Western Canada, that's something that a talented CAO looking at your organization would want to hear. But also back to the chair's original question, that there be enough flexibility that this not be baked, and the timing's going to work this way anyways, but that new CAO would have an opportunity to be a part of this as well, to the extent to which they bring that. But I think that whole notion about using your current CAO's experience, like what's on the agenda that he knows his team could have decided if the procedures bylaw allowed it to be off? You know, if we had to have a shorter meeting, and I keep talking about the length of meetings, and I don't want to misconstrue. The length of a meeting isn't necessarily a problem. It's are the meetings where we share the diverse opinions around a matter, or is it just absorbing? You know, are we using the talent that the communities have sent through elected officials in the highest and best use? And that's really where delegation comes, is not to give people nothing to do or to say you're all mucking in as elected officials. It's to create space for the higher level policy discussions that often get buried in like de minimis kind of small discussions. So I just think this is a really good timing around recruitment. And if, you know, even if you decide to go a different direction with this, if there's any help that I can provide in how to message that in your recruitment, I just think this is something that CAOs want to join organizations that are doing self-analysis as well. I see the CAO nodding, so I hope that in my Brady bunch, he's right in the middle for me. So, any other questions just about, I know that for some of you, the proposal will be lacking specificity on the back end in terms of where do we go after this survey. And in large part, that is because of the desire to ask for the board. Now, if we've got a little bit more clarity around some of those top issues that I can get from the CAO, we can flesh that out very quickly in terms of what the next steps look like. It will require, though, some time spent with staff to identify what resources there are to do this sort of work in-house. And, you know, the extent, because this is not necessarily complicated work, but it can be time-consuming work to change. And especially if you're looking at a procedures bylaw, you know, there's threads in there that you pull one thread and it does touch on something else. So you've got to be a little bit careful. But what I understand is you want this to be, you want to focus on things that can make a difference right away, but understand that this will be a process through the remainder of the term, likely for you to be making different changes as it goes versus imploding the whole organization and starting fresh. Am I understanding that this is a path towards governance excellence, but also you want to see some things happening?
Yeah, I think there are some things that we could do right now, you know, some really quickly. But certainly we need to look at the longer term. I personally don't see this as an exercise that is going to fix everything in a couple of months. You know, it's the beginning of a journey. Sorry, Chris, please.
Yeah, I think, and maybe I'm just thinking out loud a little bit, but I guess I'd sort of anticipate there might be some learning or instruction around just some fundamentals of governance, and there's all kinds of different approaches and so on, because like and you would use then that understanding, or once we coalesced or agreed upon a framework or whatever, then we might say, okay, so now how do we apply that to our procedures bylaw? How do we start applying that to all those things? But so far, a lot of the discussion has been a little bit more focused on which ones of these things, like procedures bylaw or certain pain points, have we identified that we want to tackle. And I guess I'm maybe asking if we expect there will be some of that foundational piece or learning as a first step, or can or will we jump right into sort of tackling some of the mentioned pain points?
Basic.
I think, first of all, great question. I would say both. I think that when you undertake something like this, you start making moves, but I think also understanding, and candidly, part of the governance survey is around evening out and reminding people what good governance looks like. So some of the, how whenever you do a survey, the questions are messaging as well as the data you get back from a survey. So I think, when we use the word governance, I think all of us are using it differently. And so defining what strong governance looks like, and just by way of example, to me, it's effective decision-making, the ability to pivot when a decision needs to be changed versus, one of the things that I'm seeing with a lot of regional districts is things are getting so big and heavy that we're circling back into things that were decided 4 years ago versus moving forward. Now, the other thing about this is, does the board as a whole agree that a focus on governance is important? Like, I know you've gone through your strategic planning and it made the list. Is it generally something that the board as a whole agrees on, though? Or is it something that just got more dots than other things? Like, is this a consensus focus area? Or does it depend on what it does to individuals' abilities to do things the way they want to do?
I think it was a consensus. I'm trying to think if anybody was opposed or not very keen about it, but I can't think of anyone.
I think that the pushback will come when we start to roll out proposed changes. That some people have different trust levels, for example. Some people are very comfortable delegating authority behaviorally, just by their personalities, they're more comfortable with that. So I think with some of these changes, we've also got people that are very black and white versus people that thrive in gray. And you as a board will have to, if everything's black and white, you'll also find that you're bumping up against things a lot. Like, what makes sense isn't necessarily what's written. So some of this will be a change management exercise for the chair of the board as some of these changes roll out. And I think that that's something to keep in mind as chair, that navigating how some of these changes occur is going to it is going to impact some other things that happen. How committees meet, how often committees meet. Because when we talk about board governance, it's impossible to de-link that from committee governance. And it also, the reality is that your governance also has to match up to the people you have. It's not an ideal structure. It's also got to meet the needs of the individuals the community sent, the staff that you have. So it's a bit more of a dance than than it sounds like. I'm sounding very vague, and I'm normally somebody who's super direct. So I realize that I don't know enough to be as decisive as I would normally like to be right now on what matters most. But for those of you that I haven't worked with in the past, the only thing I can tell you is I do have a bias for action, even though I'm talking with this first step being an investigative process. I am not a consultant that gets stuck on analysis. But I do think it's important not to move decisively in perhaps not the most efficient direction first. So sort of balancing that. But I understand even in looking at the proposal that it's not as precise on when are we going to see these things changed. I simply don't know enough to be that directive yet.
Knowing what I know of you, Tracy, you are a straight shooter. And so I appreciate your honesty in this, that, you know, it's a slow roll into something that will pick up speed pretty quickly once you have some framework to work within. And I think, you know, the people around this room can certainly help you get there when you know what we're asking. So
The most important thing is downloading whatever's in your CAO's brain quickly,
yes,
because that time period is coming up quicker than any, like that's a hard deadline. Not that he's disappearing off the face of the earth, but I think that this process of the change management inside the organization, because, you know, there are people that will have new work put on them as a result of this process. And that's my only, you know, sense of urgency and patience in equal measure, so that when you act on different changes, it can be done decisively and they're the right changes, sort of with surgical precision. I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear from your CAO about the capacity inside the organization to support, you know, governance, and what sort of is the capacity. And obviously capacity is only a function of how important it is to the board, but to the CAO, I'm wondering if through the chair.
Right.
Yeah, through the chair, I think it's a really, I think it's a really good opportunity from a staff perspective, but one that needs to be programmed with an understanding of where Angela's team is. So I say it's a really good opportunity because Angela's still in the process with, I think, one more recruitment to go of building a legislative and corporate team that will be robust enough to do the work that the board has asked of it, probably for the first time in a long time. So 2 legislative coordinators, one who's still relatively new, one who's joining Angela's team at the end of this month, and then a legislative assistant is the next and last person to hire. And those folks being able to join an organization as it goes through work in support of the board and looking at governance is great, because those are the folks on the staff side, apart from the leadership team that will interact with the board, who will exercise the governance process. And so I think that's actually a really neat opportunity. If I'm joining an organization and I have the opportunity from the ground floor to get in on understanding and helping build that or shift that governance process or support change, I think that's really good. The only caution is recognizing that those folks need to get in, need to get trained, and need to be in a position to be able to participate in that. And so I think, you know, to be fair to Angela and her team, that we've sort of talked about November-ish of this year, December-ish of this year, of them being in a reasonable spot, which is why in our minds, this notion of engaging the board, establishing priorities, putting them on the work plan for 2024 is achievable and supportable from a time and space perspective.
Basic.
Through the chair, the other thing is we as a team can also help in gathering resources from other local governments. We've got a really good database of different tools, because it's way easier to poke holes in other people's stuff than to start from scratch and to sort of get a sense of how, not that you want to be, you know, copying everywhere else. There's an opportunity to do things new and better, but that's still predicated on knowing what the current state is. And so looking at, you know, other procedure bylaws, for example, just, you know, where have people been able to practically delegate authority? Where have people been able to streamline their agendas? What has been done already? Because one of the things from working with local governments for more than 25 years now is that things that have worked elsewhere are easier for boards and councils to approve versus, you know, something pulled out of thin air. Just being able to find things that are working and make it a made in SLRD solution. From brief discussions, you have the composition as a board to be extraordinarily high functioning if your systems are in support of that. And it's a really good time to do this sort of as you come in round the curve on your first year, because people are still fresh by what surprised them. What didn't make sense for your new folks when they started. And, I think that ability to challenge the way things happen is something that we do lose over time. We get frustrated, but we don't know what a different state might look like. And I can help with that just with my work with other regional districts. Through in this province, I've had the opportunity to work with, well over half of them in different ways, largely around strategic planning, but also on other decision-making models, policy-driven decision-making that may be of use to you as a board as well. Any other questions through the chair?
Jenna?
Thanks through the chair. I think my only other question is, so we have the package from you and the timelines proposed. Is there anything further that you need from this committee, or are staff looking for specific direction at this point, just to help move this conversation forward?
Craig, do you have an answer to that?
If I could, through the chair, yes, the next step that we'd be looking for is board direction to proceed, committee direction to proceed, which and if that's the desire of the committee, we'd go ahead and do that. Or if there's alternate direction, of course, we're happy to take that.
And through the chair, if there's nothing more you need from me and you're going to talk about me and you want me to drop off, talk about me behind my back. Just let me know, Chair, if there's anything further that I can provide in this meeting.
I just have a question for Craig. Do we need to have something to take to the board next week?
Thanks, Chair. I would recommend that next week, simply a verbal update from yourself would be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Okay, last chance before we dismiss Tracy.
Just before I leave, Mr. Chair, thank you so very much for the opportunity to speak to your board. And if you do decide to go a different direction, just know as well that I will be available to both your current CAO and any future CAO, just as the sector is big. So thank you for your consideration.
Well, thank you. Chris, did I see your hand up?
Oh.
No, it's okay. I took it back down. Fine, thanks.
Okay, well, Tracy, thank you so much for being here, and enjoyed listening to you, and you've given us something to think about for sure.
Thank you so very much.
And something to talk about. So
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Well, there we go. So that was 5.3. And now we have next steps and direction to start. Craig, I have a question. What exactly is our situation with Tracy at the moment? Do we have any commitment to her? Or?
No, we don't. The board authorized the committee and me on behalf of the committee to go ahead and sole source, but this is so I wanted to bring Tracy forward to share her approach with the committee, because I thought it was important, because you would be the ones going through the process and it's your objective. But no, we have no contractual relationship with her. She was brought to pitch her wares, if you will.
Okay, then perhaps I'll ask committee members if you'd like to comment on that. Vivian, I see your hands up, and then Jen.
Thank you. I think she'll be an excellent candidate. And I like the approach. And I also feel like the board is ready to do this in a general sense. Like the question about consensus, I would say, yes, we have consensus. I do think that we're functioning fairly well. I also think CAO Dalton has strengthened the organization considerably. I appreciate that. And I think this might help us keep up some positive momentum. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen?
Thank you. I would put a motion on the floor that we direct staff to engage the services of Tracy Lawrenson to undertake a review of our governance and to work with our committee on improving our framework and to report back to the board the decision of the committee, I guess, is the motion that I'd put forward if there's a seconder.
Seconded by Jenna. Any discussion or any questions on that? Chris?
Yeah, I support this. I think just looking through this, what I'm sort of anticipating is that at the end of this is maybe our next starting point. I guess I'm sort of assuming that this is not going to get us to, well along the way to deciding a new procedures bylaw and all those things, but to know sort of where we need to focus on governance, if that makes sense. Like, I guess I'm still assuming there's some framework understanding we need, and some of the things you talked about, like what is our role and some of those pieces. I think I'm sort of expecting that what she may discover is that's where we need to start looking, but so I guess that's just a comment, but supportive of pursuing this and seeing where it goes.
Jenna?
Thanks to the chair. I will definitely be supporting the motion on the floor. I think that this is a good direction. And I think the timing is interesting. I did have some reservations at first, just given the transition that we have with CAO coming up. But I actually think it puts us in a really good position to do this work and get some external support to move it forward. We can get a download from CAO Dalton before he goes. The board can continue to work with Tracy on the survey, and it gives time. Really appreciate CAO Dalton's assessment of Ms. Belsham's team and getting them up to speed in the fall. And then hopefully my anticipation of this work would actually come out as Director Pettingill said, with kind of a high priority list of areas that we then hopefully have a bit of staff capacity to action. But I think that the governance work starts with the board. And I think focusing some board time and capacity over the next few months to get us there is still a good use of our time, despite some of the transitions that are happening within the organization. And hopefully that sets us up for success with a new CAO coming in. And I appreciate the framework and the approach that Tracy presented. I think it'll serve us well. And I look forward to doing the work. Thanks.
Vivian, did you want to add anything? Okay, in that case, I'll call the question. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Excellent. Okay, what else do we need to do at this point?
Number 6 is number 6.
I just wondered if there's anything else we need to do under 5.3. Any other discussion? Do you feel that we're, with that motion, we're ready to just move forward on it? Sounds like it. Okay, any late business? Are you aware of any late business? Oh, I thought you had something wrong. No late business. I have this vision of Craig laying on a couch with some things over his ears and plugged directly into a computer so that we can hit download and benefit from all his wisdom.
It wouldn't take long. It would be a short download.
Oh, well, it's high speed these days, Craig. It shifts a lot of information very quickly. Okay, It looks like we're at number 8. If somebody would like to move adjournment. Oh, we're racing to do that. Good. Moved by Janet, seconded by Dirk. All in favor? No one's opposed. This meeting is adjourned.